never killed, and villagers think they're selfish or meddle too much in their community affairs. And so priests were accountable to the people and not a higher power. It is in this context that our, the movement intellectual S.P. Uday Kumar, Uday for short, steps in. He and other activists have been trying to spread the anti-nuclear message for 20-odd years in Kudankulam, but it was only after the emergency drill that villagers sought him out. Fukushima, and ironically the Department of Atomic Energy, made visible to the villagers what was previously intangible and invisible, and gave Uday a credibility where he previously had little. Uday is a Western-educated member of the urban elite. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Hawaii, and he and his wife frequently spend time in the US and universities teaching. He insisted that if villagers wanted his guidance, all of their struggles would have to be non-violent and based on Gandhian principles, and even threatened to leave when villagers faced a violent protest early on. But the villagers agreed to try things his way, and Uday began by convening a struggle committee called the People's Movement Against Nuclear Energy, or PMANE, along with the priest of the local church. PMANE, viewing the men as drunkards, targeted the women to spearhead the protest. The women latched onto images of bodily harm and harm to children, and although this served to reify a pro-natalist stance, where women were once more ascribed a reproductive and caretaking role, women of Edith Thackeray also embraced this as well. Uday Kumar held informal classrooms to educate villagers about the dangers of nuclear energy, with many international speakers from Japan, Germany, the US, and India. Villagers were encouraged to listen with disciplined silence to speakers telling them about the risks of nuclear and coal power plants, of alternative renewable energy sources, of struggles happening in other parts of the country, other anti-nuclear struggles, of Chernobyl and developments in Fukushima, and of India's anti-colonial struggle for independence against the British, and of their own history, of Gandhi and his relevance to the present movement, and of Bhopal and the liability of foreign corporations. The visitors, or the villagers, listened to these lectures for a few months and had no trouble linking nuclear disasters and livelihood destruction to the erosion of democracy. They had already experienced a state withholding ration cards for food because of their protests, food supplies, their passports were taken away for those working as laborers in the Middle East. They were being charged with sedition and waging war against the state during peaceful protests. They'd been beaten up, thrown into jail, their places ransacked, had been told by psychiatrists sent from the government that they were paranoid and delusional for protesting nuclear energy. And so together with the lectures and their experiences, they began knitting together a coherent narrative of destruction to ecology, health, livelihood, and democratic politics. The villagers talk about thorium mining and the monazite sands, how that destroyed the coastline, and how the sands had levels of background radiation leading high rates of cancer. Many of them saw the devastation of the 2004 Sumatran tsunami that hit that area, and knew that the half-built Kudankulam nuclear power reactor had gotten flooded and that migrant workers had died there and were secretly buried. Women claimed that during the emergency drill, 23 women had spontaneous miscarriages. From nearby thermal power plants, the villagers knew that heated effluent water injected into the sea killed the plankton of the fish and that their livelihoods depended on, and many were also promised jobs at the plant but were too old by the time the plant was constructed. As such, the kinds of scientific knowledge that helped bind their collective identity were mantras. The lessons of past disasters became condensed, mythologized, and distilled into handfuls of aphorisms. We will grow a sixth finger. Our children will be deformed. There will be an earthquake. Our fish will die. Our wounds will become barren. The radiation will give us cancer. These mantras were not risks so much as certainties that would inevitably end in death if the plant were to go online. Also significant is the physical space in which all of these learning activities happened. As the movement gained momentum, the Church of Edith Thackeray created a huge bamboo tent on its steps to fit over 3,000 people. The large dais of the church became a shrine with images of Fukushima and deformed children. It also had awards that they'd won and photos of martyrs, and statements from international figures like Noam Chomsky and Arun Roy. This sacred space embodied the villagers' struggle and acted as a spiritual anchor from which they drew strength. And as villagers learned and talked to one another, women took the lead in organizational duties. They're the ones who drew up lists of who would participate in what protests, divided up childcaring duties, cooking, collecting food, money, filling up water, and came up with the idea of hand-rolling cigarettes during fasts and sitting protests so they'd earn a little extra income. And they're the ones who decided to sleep in front of the church at night to prevent the police from ransacking their houses after dark. But even beyond these bonding organizational activities, women were active in sloganeering, writing pamphlets, and framing the protests. One woman even came up with the idea of carrying the figurative dead body of democracy and cremating it. The men, too, are instrumental in organizing. As the movement progressed, they didn't drink nearly as much. They were more involved in family life. They'd taken care of the kids while women were at protest, and conflicts were resolved more through deliberative measures instead of physical assaults. So movement intellectuals like S.P. and Martin, the struggle community, talk of being transformed as well. A shy, retiring academic who had never expected to be at the forefront of the internationally known anti-nuclear movement, and learned a great deal about listening to people and validating their emotional responses to perceived grievances. He established his credibility by insisting on being treated no differently than villagers, and establishing an egalitarian consensus-based movement where everyone was equally informed about nuclear energy and its political and ecological implications. The villagers said that although they would protect Uday and die for him, if something were ever to happen to him, any one of them could assume the mantle of leadership. And Uday said that this model was more of a difficult path, but the right one for them. So let me briefly turn to the front stage. And from the very beginning, the struggle community decided to bracket off the people's struggle from the institutional channels of protest, like approaching the courts and courts of law. They had the people's movement and assortments of mass protests like vigils, jalsatyagras, relay fasts, and peaceful sieges by water. And these events were kind of fun bonding experiences for them too. But the people's movement is just one kind of performance, and I want to mention the other kinds by talking more about the strategic dimension of stage management and illustrate this through some of the hurdles listed here. Monamie works with numerous urban NGOs and legal experts to pursue public interest litigation to the Supreme Court by asking the court to uphold the regulatory procedures already in place. But the movement already knows that Supreme Court will side with the expert pronouncements of the Department of Atomic Energy, so Monamie has tactically used the court to create delays and raise awareness about nuclear issues in the broader public sphere. Anti-nuclear supporters have criticized Uday for framing nuclear energy in terms of Tamil victimhood, where Tamils are once more bearing the brunt of Indian energy development while other states reap the benefits. Uday and the struggle community, recognizing their mistakes, quickly shunted this to the backstage and emphasized how nuclear energy was detrimental to India as a whole. And the Prime Minister accused the movement of being funded by foreigners and invoked the trope of the foreign hand, resurrecting quickly issues of self-sufficiency, sovereignty, and colonial rule. And in fact, if one traces the money, there are inevitable international connections from local feeder NGOs. But the movement has tried to reverse that argument by saying the only foreign hand visible is that of France, Russia, and the United States, who are eager to supply their reactors. Similarly, when the government accused the movement of being a Catholic Christian movement, the struggle committee lifted the curtains up at the backstage to reveal that the church had in fact distanced themselves from the controversial issue of nuclear energy, allowing the movement to claim that they are indeed a true people's movement, highlighting their Muslim and Hindu participants. The media criticized Monamie for creating a party atmosphere where lazy, idle, and jobless people go to pass time. But the movement has emphasized the communal bonding in such front stage events. The nuclear establishment constantly asks about why now, of all times, is all this anger when plant construction began in 1987. The establishment wants to create a temporal and logical rupture by exposing that the villagers are only after short-term compensation and attention rather than long-term moratorium on nuclear energy. The movement retaliates by illustrating continuities like highlighting the handful of villagers who participated in those initial movements as children. But beneath this posturing is a deeper question of how knowledgeable villagers were about nuclear energy and currently are. According to the government, most villagers came to know about nuclear energy only in the last 3 years. This attests to the fact that villagers were brainwashed by urban activists who have their own political agenda. And this is why the struggle committee Monamie tends to minimize the classroom learning and tries to instead portray the villagers as organic intellectuals who, equipped with mere common sense, can easily criticize nuclear energy without needing formal scientific training. But disaster scripts are not always mobile as they travel through the public sphere transformation from domestic abusers and victims to empowered democratic citizens doesn't travel far in terms of what knowledge is carried. Idintaparai villagers are seen as embodying the popular will of the people, but not individual knowing citizens by both the nuclear establishment and the elite urban activists. When villagers make scientific pronouncements, anti-nuclear scientists view them with embarrassment. For citizen scientists, villagers are fulfilling the image portrayed of them by the government as scientifically illiterate. Finally, I want to provide a comparative perspective. I've been to other protest sites in states of Maharashtra, Haryana, West Bengal, and the social compositions and politics of these nuclear protests, anti-nuclear protests, are quite different. In Maharashtra, for example, the communities are quite heterogeneous with different castes, religions, and socioeconomic status. When urban activists come, only village heads tend to learn about nuclear energy, and it's not successfully disseminated to everyone else. Villagers don't feel ownership of their representatives in the way Idintaparai villagers are invested in Pimane. As a result, the disaster scripting of common villagers have more to do with their experiences of everyday institutional violence than with developing anti-nuclear identities, and have more to do with forming some alternate subjectivities. I want to end with suggesting that the offstage should be added to the dramaturgical metaphor, backstage and front of stage, where potential actors await entry. In the anti-nuclear landscape, there are several ideas that never make it to the backstage of organization and strategy. Many women in Maharashtra, for instance, fear that there will be a rise in sexual assaults and rapes because of all the migrant workers coming in to build the nuclear power plant, and the state authorities have forbidden them to walk in groups there, so they can only walk in singles or twos. So these kinds of issues remain on the fringes and away from public discussion, which tends to focus on reproductive health. Science, too, remains offstage. There are only a handful of citizen scientists taking on challenges of unknown science, like epidemiological surveys and geological bathymetry maps to better understand seismic activity around nuclear installations. And only a few can critique reactor design in nuclear storage sites. All the citizen scientists I spoke to lament about feeling marginalized and invisible by both the nuclear establishment that chooses to ignore them, and by the anti-nuclear activists who are more compelled by moral and political arguments. And science being offstage in the anti-nuclear movement has much to do with scientific culture of secrecy within the nuclear establishment, where scientists fear for their jobs and they speak against the department. And there have been, how they treat whistleblowers is also an interesting thing. You can't be a whistleblower unless you're an expert. There's a Supreme Court case where someone who had only class 12 education, and he was deemed as not a whistleblower. So the offstage then is critical to knowing who and what kinds of ideas get excluded from performances and try to understand the reasons for this exclusion. So thank you very much.
Questions?
Bhadra from the University of Nottingham. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Very interesting. You proposed an off-stage, right, dimension of the movement, the anti-nuclear movement. And I was interested when you talk about the science, the off-stage science. I'm sorry, I don't know if I could follow you. But could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because do you mean that then that would be because you said that there are no scientific arguments among within the movement, that they use moral and political values.
Yes. Yeah.
And the science of nuclear, would be restricted to the off-stage dimensions.
So there's only like about 4 scientists. Like there's just a very, very limited number of experts who
are they connected to the movement, or
they are sort of connected, but they're sort of used as sort of we have our experts. But the actual information they produce, they're sort of like figureheads. They stand there and we have our experts, but they can't produce science that is actually used by the anti-nuclear movement. They don't produce science that's used by the anti-nuclear. They do some bathymetric surveys and epidemiological surveys, but it's not globalized in any way. And the nuclear establishment also completely ignores this science. So that's an interesting question that I'm trying to figure out. I'm wondering if it's a cultural issue, like the moral, emotional kinds of arguments have more currency, than sort of the scientific arguments. And the funny thing is, it's all sort of under, the Department of Atomic Energy has a whole public literacy, scientific literacy program. And so they're trying to create the model of the citizen by having to know what kind of knowledge is relevant to nuclear energy. And if you don't agree with this, then you're obviously illiterate and you don't belong in this public sphere. But the anti-nuclear movement isn't really engaging the public literacy domain at all. I mean, that's what I've been, and so I'm trying to figure out the puzzle a little bit more.
I found it very interesting, your presentation. I was just wondering, what's the ultimate thing that you really want to find out? I mean, not just to say that the question you were asking are not interesting. I was just interested in you personally, when you're working on what is the thing that you.
So that's sort of, I mean, I'm interested in how, in understanding how people think of them as citizens, and themselves as citizens, as India is supposed to be the world's largest democracy, but when you look for democracy, you don't really find it in a lot of places. And so how is this idea, all the stuff in STS, everything is about liberal democracy, it's about liberal democracy. But what's being created in India, how are people, seeing themselves, and so this whole transformation is very interesting to me. And this idea that subaltern subjectivities are actually created, feeling marginalized. They're not just historical, constructs that have happened all throughout history, but they're actually formed by these issues of, representation and, so I guess, I don't know, these kind of personal stories are what interest me the most, I guess, so.
I also find it very interesting work you're doing, and just for my curiosity, you mentioned at the beginning as a theoretical framework, the social technical imaginaries, but I haven't understand really how we use them in this.
So, socio-technical imaginaries, Sheila Jasanoff is quite slippery with the concept.
Yeah.
She uses it in very macro-scale national issues. But if you look at the website, she also talks about counter-imaginaries or imaginaries of resistance. Okay. So it's kind of an all-encompassing. It's a very elastic concept that includes both the macro.
Yeah, I was wondering because usually it's more connected to the policy and government sphere, and maybe that you're trying to find out if this is somehow influencing in this major social.
Yes, yeah. So I haven't talked about it here, but ultimately I want to know how these very local, grounded imaginaries that are forming around nuclear energy, around disaster, are actually impacting or having any kind of say in the national policy level, and so far really none. So, yeah.
Okay. So let's move on to the next presentation.
So I guess you all are familiar with the term NGO, so environmental NGOs. So the title for my presentation is slightly different from what was in the abstract, because this is really much work in progress. So I called it now Engaged Lobbyism and Resigned Acceptance, the Norwegian NGOs approach to carbon capture and storage. First, a little bit about carbon capture and storage, if you're not familiar with the concept. It's technology, it's an abbreviation for, of course, and CCS, which is most used. And it describes the technological process where CO2 is captured from a facility, a power plant, or a factory. And it's very complicated. It's not the topic for my presentation here, and it's also difficult for me as a social scientist to go into the technology itself. But both there are different technologies for capturing the carbon, transportation, of course, and also the storage, which is either underground or subsea, depending on where it is. In Norway, which is my case, this is subsea storage, which is most relevant. So my project is twofold, and I will present one of the parts here. which is based on my interviews with the Norwegian NGOs. So my question so far is how the Norwegian NGOs interpret CCS, whether they are supportive or critical, and how they frame CCS. So until now I've used the concept of framing. I'm of course familiar with Delphi and also Michel Calon from STS, and also a very useful quote I just added there from this bit of the meeting. It was published in Science in July. So to set the scene for a little bit in the Norwegian context, because the Norwegian CCS case is kind of particular. So this is the New Year speech from our Prime Minister at that time, Jens Stoltenberg, in 2007. And what probably will strike you here is that he used the link to the American Apollo expedition. He called it our moon landing. And he also set a particular time frame. We will develop full-scale CCS in 7 years. So it was very like, this was really, it's been quoted so much in the Norwegian opinion and in the Norwegian discourse after 2007. And it has also formed the debate a lot in the Norwegian context. So I'll explain a little bit then how the Stoltenberg speech, but also in general, the status of CCS in Norway first, the political status. We had to go back to the 1990s first, because it may sound strange to you, which is not Norwegian, that gas power in Norway has been framed as very polluted, very dirty form to produce power. So we had something called the gas-fired power plant struggle in the 1990s. And you see these two, the banner there and the logo there is from the joint campaign against gas-fired power plants, it says. And this has been then really important, and it was actually at that time the Norwegian NGO Bellona first entered the scene related to CCS, because they launched something they called we're not against gas-fired power plants, we're against emissions from gas-fired power plants. So that kind of that changed the discourse a lot in Norway, because from then on it was possible to talk about gas-fired power plants as something clean then. And it kind of changed also. It was very difficult to campaign against these power plants after this new element of CCS had entered the debate. So, a more deeper explanation might also be the second pointer, that it allows Norway to continue as an oil and gas producer. It's not said directly, but it's very much there in the debate that we have a responsibility to develop CCS, because our emissions and the continuation of a society with carbon kind of requires CCS to be developed. So it's one Norwegian scholar who called this a technological compromise as political glue, because all the parties in Norway, depending on like NGOs, politicians, and also some researchers, scientists, saw this as a technology that could work to make everyone satisfied, so to speak. So the question then is, if this factor makes the status of CCS in Norway somehow unique, and if it's more difficult than for the NGOs to criticize CCS. So the last one was the political status, and then technological status, which is really difficult actually to discuss. As I said, it's a tricky question because it depends on who you ask. And the other part of my project is interviews with technological experts and engineers. And I don't get a clue when I interview them, because they say different things about the technological status. And also in the international research papers, you see very different views on CCS. So, but one thing is for sure, that the Mongstad facility, the example of Prime Minister Stoltenberg, it's now the failed moon landing. They closed down full-scale facility only some months ago, right after the national elections. Very strategic timing. The thing that remains now then is the so-called technology center amongst the TCM. But the thing there is that they will only develop capturing technology. So they will, if they manage to capture carbon, they will still emit it. So I mean, okay, it might solve something and it might be a good example for the rest of the world, but still at Mongstad, the facility there will emit CO2 still. Then we have two examples as well, which is the one is Sleipner, which is if you're familiar with the CCS literature, Sleipner is kind of common because it's the one example facility where we actually have stored CCS, stored carbon since 1996. And it's still working. The other one is Snøhvit, which actually also only 2-3 weeks ago, they said it was leakages. They had to stop also to store carbon there at Snøhvit, which is in the Bhadra Sea in the north of Norway. So whether these are good examples or not is also difficult to say. So just 2 quotes from the EIA and IPCC to show how important CCS is framed internationally. It's kind of impossible to discuss climate without having CCS as a substantial part of the whole package. So back again to the NGO part. There are some studies, comparative international studies. I just mentioned there's more literature than this, but just some studies. It's one really good case study from Norway, which only was one NGO, Bhadra. And there are lots of more general studies on CCS who contains the NGO perspective, but not only the NGO perspective. So my point here has been to see the dynamic between the NGOs inside one country, which is, in my case is Norway. So as I mentioned before, I conducted qualitative interviews with all the Norwegian NGOs, also of course the published material from these NGOs, and I'm studying the dynamic between these NGOs. And it's also been important to me to look beyond Bellona and Zero, which has been really dominant in the literature so far, because these two are the most important ones when it comes to CCS. I also wanted to go into the other NGOs to look at their perspective. So I made my own table then to group these NGOs, and maybe since you're probably not familiar with these abbreviations and what the NGOs stand for in Norway, Bellona and Zero are foundations and not organizations as such. So I will explain more on the later slide. But and then we have NU, which is Nature and Youth, or Friends of the Earth, Young Friends of the Earth. And then we have WWF and something called Future in Our Hands. And Friends of the Earth, the normal Friends of the Earth, is NBF, and then Greenpeace, of course. So here's why I have grouped them. I found first something about framing. What I found studying this material is that there are 4 very dominant framings when it comes to CCS in Norway, and these can be said to represent narratives from positive to negative towards CCS. So of course, first the necessity frame, which is also very dominant internationally. We need CCS; it will be important for the future. And then something I call the bridge frame. These are the organizational people who are a bit more critical, and they see CCS as a bridge towards the renewable society. CCS will only be there for some time, but not forever. And then, even more skeptical in a way, is the research frame, which I actually struck me a little bit in this when I read through this material, because even the NGOs that are critical to CCS, they see that we can spend some research on it, but we don't want it. So it's kind of contradictory in a way. And then of course the carbon lock-in frame, which is those are really against CCS. They don't want it because it like takes resources and it makes other technologies difficult to develop. But then apart from these like frames from positive to negative, I've also included something I call the involvement frame, which is interesting in a way because it says like how involved the different NGOs are in CCS from what's something they really want to engage in and something that indifferent or critical or like passive on. So the active supporters, as I mentioned, is Belluna and Zero, and they have an ownership to CCS since long. And they have really, when you interview them, they really faith in this technology, the technology, and they say, okay, it's ready-made, it's ready technology, it's only to roll it out. We can apply it everywhere, and it will be an important mitigation technology now, if the politician says yes to it. And they do so through lobbying and networking especially. So only one quote from Belluna to illustrate this. If you're serious or if you don't recognize the role of CCS, then you have not understood climate change, which is pretty hard, I would say. So it's kind of labeling CCS critics as climate skeptics. Implicitly that it's impossible to do something with climate change without even having CCS as a substantial part of it. So then, this is interesting because Nature and Youth used to be as engaged in CCS as Belluna, but they have given up. They say they've given up campaigning to CCS. It's difficult to engage young people, and it's a never-ending story without appeal. And I conducted my interviews before this MOSAP facility closed down, so they kind of arrived at this. So they one quote from NU as well. CCS is very technical and difficult for people to understand. Therefore, I don't think NU's role should be to discuss CCS in media anymore. Young people need a more simplified environmental debate. Which is interesting when this is the most important climate technology in Norway. They say that we shouldn't engage in this anymore, shouldn't be involved in this anymore. And so the third group, which I call passive indifference, these are the research frame people, WWF, Future No Hands, Friends of the Earth. And they cannot or will not engage in CCS. But it's a possible bridging technology if you ask them really, if they had to say something, they say it might be possible. And in principle positive to R&D, but not as, it's important, not as an excuse for action in other fields. So they say it is difficult to create enthusiasm around CCS because it has nothing to do with your everyday life. That's why we work with other stuff. CCS is more like for technical magazines. We haven't had an opinion on CCS since 2005. So 2005 was really the year it peaked, kind of, all the organizations and politicians had an opinion on CCS. But when I interviewed this guy here from this was from Friends of the Earth, he said that okay, we were kind of forced by other NGOs to have an opinion, and we were slightly positive, but we hadn't engaged in or involved since then. So also kind of interesting and a bit surprising was the finding from Greenpeace. It wasn't really surprising that they were critical, because Greenpeace is critical to CCS everywhere, all over the world. It's more like they're so passive that they're also given up on working with CCS. So the quote is very illustrative. We don't bother to put an effort in this. It's not very important anyway. We don't use that much money. And then they was like, okay, we use some billions. But we hadn't used those resources differently anyway, taking the current Norwegian discourse into account. Those who are interested know that we think this is a really bad idea, so yes, we have given up. Says the guy from Greenpeace. So my conclusion so far, I might find more when I go through more of my material, is that the Belluna and Zero appear as the biggest supporters of drivers for CCS in Norway, and they frame it as unavoidable. And the statutes as compromise technology makes it politically uninteresting for other actors. And there are actually no active critics, which is interesting when you see kind of this technology, that it has kind of failed technologically. When as current research only frames NGOs as either supporting, like pushing for its expansion, or openly questioning it, the situation in Norway is more like passive. You frame CCS as a matter of non-involvement. I mean, regardless of the position on the technology per se. I mean, nature and youth is positive. Greenpeace are negative, but still there's both in this non-involvement frame. So the situation can thus be described as one of resigned acceptance that stems from the high barrier for involvement, and that they prioritize to do other stuff, and the general lack of debate of technology's role in the Norwegian environmental discourse. So that was pretty much it. Thank you.
So, questions? Yes.
It's just more about, we have a PhD working on this and on the process of emergence of European policy on CCS. You didn't mention the energy revolution scenario by Greenpeace, which is a no-CCS, no-nuclear scenario.
Yeah.
It was used by Greenpeace at the European level to try to counter the European policy.
And WWF did something similar in Norway, actually. A future scenario without CCS.
So it has been criticized in the Strain report when the IPCC issued its report on renewable energy. This was a problem, but still it's existing. And
it exists as a scenario, but it's not. I mean, when WWF was publishing this in Norway, it didn't get any interest. I think the CCS framing is so strong in Norway, so it's difficult to come up with an alternative 100% renewable scenario.
That was basically a remark that, for example, Friend of the Earth in the UK has supported CCS. WWF was close to Greenpeace first, and then took stance that was different from Greenpeace. So your picture is very Norwegian.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's very. I mean, also when I interviewed these people, they said, okay, our mother organization might have a different view, but that's our view, taking the Norwegian discourse into account. So they actually said that.
And I have one question. The Slackner project in 2011, they detected some oil leaks on the surface of the sea, of the waters, and they posted it. Statoil posted it on their website in Norwegian, and Greenpeace took it and advertised. Where is it? Was that real problems on the project, or
there was an issue? It was a big issue actually in Norway at that time, but still, it's difficult to. I mean, it's difficult to say who's right. I mean, was it really a big issue or not? But I'm not sure actually. I mean, the Slackner is still used as an exemplary thing for that CCS works. So I think it's actually Norway's framed as a minor problem, but it was a problem at that time.
I want to ask, what is the position of the scientists? Do the scientists enter in this debate, and the scientists are linked to the NGOs, as we know, some of them are?
I mean, Bellona and Zero use a lot of science. And Bellona and Zero, these two big Norwegian NGOs use a lot. I mean, they have scientists employed, so they use a lot of science. The other ones now, I mean, that's why also part of the explanation.
So what is the position of the scientists? Isn't there a debate?
Yeah, it's a huge debate. And that's I didn't mention it because it wasn't focused on the presentation, but yeah, I mean, the other part of my project shows that it's a huge debate, I mean, between science, and they don't agree about the viability of CCS at all. I mean, obviously the scientists employed in Zero and Bellona, they have to kind of buy this because they're actually lobbying and they're kind of honest about that that's what they do. But the other more neutral scientists that are doing in research institutes and universities, they're really some are positive and some are really negative. So,
perhaps I have a naive question, but just as I was not used to context, but these Beluna in Zero, are they actually Norwegian? They are foundations, you said. They're Norwegian
ENGOs.
Norwegian foundations.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
And what about the interest behind? I mean,
because they
get the commitment of all the gas you have stored and everything else.
They get their funding from the private sector, basically. They don't get any funding from the state. So, for instance, and the Luna says that they don't want funding from the state because they want to be independent.
Independent.
Yeah, but so yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so yeah.
Perhaps if you also still focusing on the NGOs, but if you try to go after the hidden interest, and not only the NGOs.
But it's not very hidden that they're kind of really like open about who's funding them. It's even the oil companies.
Or perhaps I was thinking also about the other NGOs. Why are they so different in Norway? For instance, the difference of their approach in Norway or
definitely. I think it has as I mentioned about the Norwegian situation says that like CCS is so important. It can't be against. It can't be.
You can't be against if you have so much oil.
I mean, you have to justify the oil production.
You also have the carbon tax in Norway. You also have
carbon
tax, which make the economic situation of CCS very different. And this is why Slack has been possible. Another country would not have been possible to live outside. So.
Thank you for the presentation. Thinking about the reasons why those other NGOs would be rather passive and not actively supporting CCS. Do you think, do you have any study of the public perception of CCS in Norway?
Yeah, it's a colleague of mine.
Okay, would that be linked to a lack of social controversy, or at least public controversy over the technology, so they wouldn't bother to, they would, the supporters would just work towards public acceptance, ex ante kind of approach, and then you wouldn't have social controversy at the public domain, so you wouldn't have really Greenpeace or the other NGOs worrying about addressing the issue related to CCS in Norway. Do you think there's a link?
Yeah, I think it might be a link. It's also, I wonder about why that, it's kind of that they have outsourced the CCS involvement to Bhadra and Zero, but still they kind of buy their version of CCS, even though when you ask them, they're more critical to the technology than Zero Bhadra, but still they don't have the capacity to involve themselves. So then they say, okay, Bhadra and Zero might be right, that in any case you don't have the resources to involve yourself, so they kind of had to do this before solution.
Would you say that it's a matter of lack of information, that they are like a passive piece? It's just...
It's not so much lack of information. I think the problem is too much information, maybe. So it's more like maybe that's like to her question as well. Like it's more like they don't see any point in involving or engaging in CCS. They want to focus on other stuff. And it's even Greenpeace, who used to be really like active critics. They see it's another quote that I didn't include there, is that it gives us bad karma. The Greenpeace guy says when I interview. So we want to focus on nature preservation or something else. Which is like popular in the wild population and stuff. So to engage in CCS, it doesn't give any like. We haven't any feedback either from the society, so why should we do it? It's more like,
Okay, so I guess we can move to the next.
I don't know what's happening to my voice, but I think I'm losing it, so I'm sorry. Perhaps I'll run out of voice in the presentation. So, change subjects completely. Talk about biofuels. What I bring here today, it's an analysis of the results of a Delphi survey that I did as part of my PhD. And so I called it Transitions in Biofuel Systems because I don't know if you're familiar with biofuels, but for ethanol, we are going through a transition from first to second generation ethanol, which is basically from ethanol made from food crops and to ethanol produced from non-edible sources, like, for example, wastes and residues, or from agricultural activities or forestry, and dedicated energy crops like willow, poplar, or perennial grasses like sweetgrass. The idea of moving to a new ethanol, which is the same final product, only it's produced from different sources, using different conversion processes, is to achieve a further reduction in CO2 emissions and avoid competition with food crops. Those are the two main political arguments to invest in cellulosic ethanol. So for this study, we looked at two different pathways, two different technological pathways that, I don't know if you can read it, they're basically TP1 and TP2. The difference is in the kind of feedstock that you use and what you do at the producing plant level, at the conversion processes. You're fermenting glucose, just like first generation ethanol, only you obtain that from a different part of the plant. So you obtain that from cellulosic parts of the plant, so you have to get your glucose from cellulose, which is quite harder than getting from crops that have their energy more available, like for example corn or sugar cane or wheat. So the two basic difference is in the feedstock and the kind of conversion process that you need to produce ethanol, but the final product is the same one. So we did a Delphi study to discuss with experts on biofuels, and by experts I mean people who published on biofuel sustainability. They were invited to assess a list of potential social impacts related to cellulosic ethanol. We had two rounds of Delphi, two-round Delphi. It was not a traditional Delphi. I don't know if you know what a Delphi study is. It's basically a method to structure dialogue among knowledge experts when you have difficult or complex issues. This Delphi was designed quite differently from traditional Delphis because we had a more closed framework to assess the impact. It's not open as when you do with a brainstorming, for example, or just say for CCS, a bunch of experts, what do you think are the viability of the technology, and then they just give their opinion. We had a set of the impacts. We had a group of experts, and we asked them about that set of impacts. We had 24 people participating in the first round and 15 in the second round. They range from very different fields. There was an open question, what's your main area of expertise? So they indicated many areas of expertise, from agriculture economics to sociology or technology or ethics or life cycle assessment. You have people with engineering backgrounds. They also had experts in public policy or innovation and energy society. You had a very mixed team of experts, also because they were targeted. We were looking at sustainability studies. So normally people who work with sustainability, they could be virtually from any kind of field of expertise. So the variables that we assessed, the impacts, they were drawn on a previous study that on the systematic review of aspects of ethanol that I published earlier this year. And from that study, where we had basically a mapping of social aspects of ethanol published in the peer-reviewed literature, we got the ones that could be seen as applied to technology, to technological change and innovation, if you would expect some of those impacts to happen or to be worsened with transition, or to be improved and avoided with transition. Were 8 impacts. I'm not going to read the definition for all of them, but basically was inclusion or exclusion of small-scale farmers, food security local level, food security at national or international levels, water security, biodiversity security, employment generation for low-skilled or unskilled workers, inclusion or exclusion of small-scale producers, and water security related to conversion processes, not to feedstock production. We thought about 3 dimensions for assessment: probability, which is quite known, but then 2 more that are tentative. And tentative because they're not fully operational. We just thought that they're important for technology assessment. When you think about reversibility and monitorability, which is basically how could you return to a situation that's of course you don't have 100% reversibility ever, but for example when you build lots of roads in a country to basically use cars, how reversible is that? You know, Brazil for example, which is completely covered by roads, how reversible is that in Brazil now that we want to perhaps use trains in the future because, you know, we're going to run out of cheap fossil fuels or biofuels will not be, you know, able to fulfill our needs. So that's reversibility on the one hand, and monitorability, which is when you're looking at impact and you're assessing impacts, how monitorable are they? Would you say that food security, monitoring the indicators for food security would be just as straightforward as indicators to look at water security at the conversion and power plant level? So we wanted to know what they thought about this regarding each impact that we proposed earlier. And also we had to work with some scenarios which were really basic. They were just indicating the principal groups of feedstock and the kinds of sources, the kind of land in which those feedstocks would be grown or collected from. And again, it was a very close exercise in itself, but it was also open. But we did want some guidance because we were coming from a previous study in which we had a fairly good idea of what among experts, what has been discussed in the past few years on social impacts of ethanol. Well, after round 1, after they completed the survey, was an online exercise. It was anonymous too. They assessed the variables, the potential impacts that were indicated, and they assessed also the assessment framework. They say things like, okay, we need a time frame for that. We do need to know the meaning of small-scale farmer, which is very dependent on the context. It's not the same small-scale farmer for us in the US that it is for you in the UK or in Spain, or it really varies. We need, so they would just, and they would also say, okay, for dedicated crops, energy crops, you would see a better use of water, for example, at land use level than you would see for other kinds of feedstock. And 2 approaches emerged from that, which is some of them were they would assess impacts based on those technical features that we proposed at the beginning, and other would just say it is completely impossible to address these issues as they are totally dependent on the context, on the political context or the social context. So that would be the governance aspects of the system. So, for example, someone from engineering studies, she would say, well, I can see that that the conversion processes used now, they are good enough to avoid, you know, the amount of water. I mean, it could be in the future because it's really an emerging technology to avoid water consumption that compared to what you have now in first generation ethanol. Someone would say you cannot say anything because if you're doing that in a place where political systems are weakened, you cannot regulate that, you cannot control that, and you might just waste water or whatever. So you cannot really analyze those impacts technologically. You would have to look at the social context and political cultures. So for phase 2, for round 2, we devised sub-scenarios, which one of the participants recommended us to do. So what we did for round 2 was basically listen to what participants had to say and change the questionnaires and adapt them according to their comments. So we just gave a little bit more of context. Those 5 scenarios, which were A, B, C, D, and E, they were transformed in A1, B, A2, and so on. And they were happening in different places in the world with different kinds of feedstock. So we had a bit of a context, and we asked them to assess impacts again. So, and the results, which are from round 2, they're both quantitative and qualitative. And quantitative because they were rating impacts. They would say probability from 1 to 5, monitorability from 1 to 5, reversibility from 1 to 5. And they had space for comments. So they would comment, whoever wanted to comment, and they would also rate. So the qualitative results, which are many comments, and I'm not going to go through them all here, just indicated that many different factors play a role in all those criteria that we were using to assess cellulosic ethanol. And they depended on both dimensions, the technical features of the system, but also the environmental, social, political context of implementation of those systems. And they're not straightforward because many experts would not know or would indicate things that other experts would never have a clue of that. Or they would even say, I wouldn't have thought of that on second round. So this is just an example for variable 1, which is the inclusion of small-scale farms in the supply chain of cellulosic ethanol. What kinds of factors that would interfere with probability, reversibility, and monitorability? So you have, for example, it will depend on transition costs, technology costs, qualified labor costs, but also the farm's perception of new markets, but also on existing markets. And if they're forming or not cooperatives, and so on. And reversibility, the same thing. And monitorability too. So many factors will play a role on those criteria. As for the quantitative results, I'm not going to go through them all again. I'm going to go fast. But basically, we just looked at the median values for ratings. And we had some best and worst case scenarios. We had some patterns. Which are not the most valuable part of the exercise. Actually, the qualitative part is much more interesting, but we do have some patterns. So we did that for each of the variables, according to each scenario, A, B, C, D, and their sub-scenarios. And the last variables, we didn't have scenarios because it was at the conversion processes level. So we saw agreement among experts in some regarding some impacts and a lack of agreement on others. And for example, for social municipal waste, the use of municipal waste to produce cellulosic ethanol, that was seen as the best case scenario for many or all of experts. They would say that the probability of producing negative impacts was low, that the reversibility was high in case of negative scenarios, or you wouldn't have to think about reversibility because it would be very unlikely that it would produce negative impacts. And that the monitorability of those would be higher, which is actually a tendency from low to high income countries for all impacts. On the other hand, ethanol obtained from short rotation copses, for example in Africa, would be seen as the worst case sub-scenario for all impacts. Again, as I said, so solid municipal waste in Canada and China are best case scenarios. Canada and China, we thought they would rate differently, but they rate the same. So they would see that there's no difference because they're talking about social municipal waste. You don't have land use change involved. So it would be the best case for both of the situations. And residues and waste collected in Western Europe. But then you would have the worst case scenarios again for low-income countries. So biodiversity. I mean, those are results specific for biofuels. But short rotation copses would perform worse than residues and wastes. For example, they would be perceived as worse than other feedstock. And cellulosic ethanol overall, experts would perceive it to exclude small-scale farmers, small-scale producers, and low-skilled workers from the supply chain, especially in low and middle-income countries. The variables are really complex. They depend on many different factors. Their dimensions can only be partially understood. There is high variability in responses regarding food security, which is a very contentious issue. low level of agreement in responses regarding what security. They would acknowledge higher levels of uncertainty for what security overall. And so I just came from a conference in Germany about energy transition studies, and they're all very, very keen of energy transition. So we would always discuss energy transition, have a very positive framing of energy transition, and say, hey, this is advanced, these are advanced biofuels, this is advanced technology. And normally what I saw from those guys who were presenting on modeling and what would be our mix, our energy mix in the future, they all take, if not all, but most of them take for granted the benefits of advanced alternatives, which is something that I'm trying to criticize a lot, because I think we don't have a clue of what could be the drawbacks of these new things. You know, biofuels, so the new generation of biofuels is supposed to, you know, overcome problems of the past. We have no idea. What they would say is that it's complex, it's difficult, I have no idea. We're talking about a global supply chain of biofuels, which impacts are delocalized. You cannot, it's not the same thing if you don't produce and consume at the same place, you can produce a feedstock somewhere else. And methods of governance, of multi-scale governance and hybrid governance are very complex in this matter. So, and the social dimension of advanced biofuels, but possibly from all the emerging science technology developments, is still poorly understood. And those were the people who were publishing on ethanol sustainability, but with a focus, or at least mentioning social aspects, because they were included, their studies were included in the systematic review that we did before. So you think that those people are the ones that really are knowledgeable of social impacts of ethanol. And the consequences of the implementation of developments are strongly context dependent. So it's really hard to generalize, and unfortunately, at the policy level, they do generalize. So we would see, for example, the European Union Renewable Energy Directive fostering the development of cellulosic ethanol, and even basically admitting that cellulosic ethanol would count double for GHG savings, you know, with the targets, without really knowing about if the GHG emissions are really going to be lower, or if there is land use change from the use of waste and residues, for example. So assumptions, problem framing, scenarios devised by initiators, which in this case were us as initiators of the small technology assessment process, but also of all the actors engaged in the assessment. They shape the outcomes of the process. You will get, I mean, you would definitely be, the outcomes will definitely be dependent on what are your assumptions. So the diversity of experts would give you a complete different pictures of viability, of, you know, benefits and drawbacks of the technology, and in different places in the world too. And we were talking only with experts. So the interdisciplinarity, we think that it's something that it just happens, you know, but I don't think so. I mean, I have I'm skeptical about it. So the dialogue, at least in this study, it's not straightforward. Some traditions, and I'm not saying that because you're an engineer, you're going to have a point of view that it's fairly only technical. You might actually, they would have both views, but you do have different, I mean, it's completely, how do you say that? It's completely from an individual perspective. It depends on what, yeah, it's really subjective, exactly. So subjectivity will play a big role in this exercise. And different types of expertise would be needed for whole system approaches. And they shouldn't be limited to institutionalized forms of scientific knowledge, which is basically what you do in technology assessment. You do close your process to advisory domains, which are totally dominated by formal scientific expertise, and you do miss lots of things because you cannot answer a bunch of questions that we will have in the exercise by just with scientific expertise. And that's all. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes, thank you very much. A couple of comments on the criterion of reversibility. If I understood correctly, that means of possibilities of reverting back to the initial social stage or situation in terms of social conditions. And I always have problems with this in other contexts as well. When I think about biofuels, I always think about Brazil, Brazilian ethanol, and the Northeast. And there the situation is that you really don't want to revert back to the earlier situation, which is bad already. So it's a question of the starting point. If the starting situation is bad, do you want to revert back? So that was just a problem with that one. And then the context where we mentioned that it all depends on the context. And you said that in the second round of Delphi you had these different contexts, but still they remain very macro. I mean, Brazil was one context, and Africa, I think, not the whole Africa, but anyhow.
Yeah.
And then the third one, a question: what do you do with your analysis? I understood that the work is still in progress, and when you show the quantitative results of rankings, and are you looking for what I see as most interesting are the outliers rather than the consensus among the experts? Trying to look beyond. I don't know if you foresee any means of going beyond what lies behind these estimates. Disagreements.
Yeah, disobedience for each scenario. The outliers are regarding the scenario, so
or not even outliers. I mean, if on the top picture, the number 4 is more interesting perhaps than those in the middle.
I don't like these quantitative results myself. I don't think they show us a lot. I don't think they tell us a lot. But I do see some patterns that I mean what I see here at least, which is B1, which is the sub-scenario of use of residues in Western Europe. You do see that 15 people who are rating it, they would say there's a median of, I mean the half of them that are rating would get a 4 for possibility of including small-scale farmers, while you get for example, all scenarios that would range for Africa and Brazil and Eastern Africa, you get half of it too. So they do tell you something, although I wouldn't stick with them, you know what I mean? But they I would say that they are coherent with the comments, which is basically people just perceive high or low income countries are more like they would have more institutional capacity to include small-scale farmers than others. So they would perhaps that guided them on this, but then you would have problems. For example, the issue of water security. So you have again outliers. Okay, scenarios where you have municipal solid waste, and they would rate really low, like possibility of compromising water security if you're using municipal solid waste, and that would be the large majority of people. So, for example, I don't know, 30. I can't remember the exact number. They put up a 1, which is I don't think this will interfere with water security at the feedstock level whatsoever, because there's no point in talking about it. But also for the conversion processes, which then we're talking about low income, middle income, and high income, you would also see that high incomes would always be a better case scenario, and for both probability and reversibility. What I mean is it's really subjective, and I would stick with those results. But I think they do have a pattern. I mean, you can still say something about them. But I'm also struggling, and I do struggle with what you said, baseline scenario. And I mean, if you don't establish a baseline, you cannot say anything. And reversibility would be really. It's kind of a technocratic dimension. I would say reversibility. When you think about just reversing something, because you could do that with a technical system, but you cannot do that with a social system. So you can't think about institutional capacity to deal with problems and perhaps trying to overcome some problems derived from implementation of this.
Continue. In the northeast of Brazil, I suppose, new biofuel innovation that does not improve the situation is a bad one. Slight simplification, but just to make a point.
Yeah, just to pick up that issue of reversibility. When you actually presented the concept, I immediately thought about these debates on resilience. There are some debates about what is resilience. And so, I mean, there is one scholar, Delphi, and she said there are three types of resilience. The engineering resilience, which is pretty much the reversibility definition that you've got there. So you reverse the state as it was before. So you see, and the problem, okay, then there are the types of resilience. Ecological resilience is when you reverse back, but you cannot actually reverse forward, you can go forward as well. But the problem with this is that there is a state of equilibrium. That's what I struggle with, this reversibility. It's like society was always in an equilibrious state, so you either go backwards or you go forwards. So there is no open, unpredictable things, things that don't go exactly as they should go. So my problem is really the equilibrium, the assumption that there is an equilibrium, and with the reversibility definition, the equilibrium is there. So
Yeah.
That's what I struggle with.
Yeah, it's very controversial. That's why I've been tentative, because there was a last minute thing, because when I was discussing with my advisor about what we should assess, what besides probability, what could be other dimensions, I was interested in monitorability because I was looking at the social impact assessment literature a lot, and what social impact assessment people try to do, it's really to operationalize the social, not trying to really, not being quantitative or anything like that, not from a positivistic point of view, but they do try to be serious about indicators. Okay, so if you're talking to me about, for example, the loss of community, how do you call that? Community, what do you call that? Bonds, cohesion, yeah. If you're talking about loss of community cohesion, which kind of indicators would you use for that? So they're really worried about those kinds of things. So monitorability was one of those. And reversibility was last minute because he's a philosopher of technology. And we were looking at, and we really had the technical system as our object of analysis. But then what I missed, and that's my fault, is that I was framing it from the social world. I was looking at social consequences of that technical, of the implementation of that technical system. So there is a lack of consistency there, which is, you're right, I agree with you. So this is almost an engineering point of view for framing reversibility. And I do want to work on that, but I was glad to include this criterion because it got lots of comments and critique, and also now, for example, another comment, and I think I could think about it and perhaps look at resilience instead, and try to
just to go ahead.
Yeah.
The concept that kind of tries to solve this issue is evolutionary resilience.
Okay.
That's another black box.
Okay.
But yeah, probably that's.
Okay, yeah, all right. If you can write me down.
It's a good review.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you, I think probably it was my fault, but I didn't understand very well. I understood that you had a huge range of, a big group, the Delphi, but do they have basic information, the baseline, they asked, they knew about the basic information. You make sometimes for the Delphi, we used to make the first workshop to some data and so on, because of course not all the people have the same information about this complex issue. So did you make this is one of my questions. The other one was the reversibility is never includes the return to the previous state of the natural conditions. It's only social.
Okay, can you repeat the last one?
Reversibility in the natural conditions are never included, of course, because when you plant ethanol, You have to change completely the landscape.
Yeah.
And again.
Okay. From that point of view, you would say, for example, you would have experts saying that if you collect residues and you don't change your whole plantation, that should be more reversible because you would just have a choice of saying, I'm not collecting residues anymore, I'm just leaving them on the ground. But if you do have, for example, a previous land use, where you have something growing there, you just get that thing down and just plant something else, that could be less reversible because you would have to actually change, and you would have changes on the soil level too, at the soil level, and you wouldn't have the same kind of soil that you would have before.
So it was included there.
Well, yeah, because it was dependent on the scenario that you were looking at. So this is a really open concept. So open criteria in the sense that depending on the scenario, they would interpret reversibility in different ways.
And also there are lots of different types of biofuels.
Yes.
You can think about crops. You can think about even marine production in land. So this was not introduced in the...
No, I just worked with ethanol. But that was a choice that I made at the beginning of my PhD because like you said, biofuels is a family of technologies. It's a big family. If you think about it, if you map them, you have so many different pathways that it would be a crazy effort to try to work with that. So I picked ethanol just because it was the most produced biofuels, and from that cellulosic ethanol, which is in technology development, it's the ones that now we're trying to start with pilot plants. So it was kind of that was why I chose to work with ethanol. I could have worked with biodiesel, but because of the level of production in the world, not talking about Europe because I wasn't focused on Europe. So that's why I picked ethanol. So that's focused on cellulosic ethanol only. And regarding your question about the expertise of those, so what I did, so I didn't do a workshop. I couldn't do that. Matter of resources, money, and people. What I did, those experts, they were selected from this previous study that was published on energy policy. So this was a systematic review. So I had some names, and from those people who were publishing on social aspects, which work had lots of information on social aspects of biofuels, I invited them, like 37 people. So I sent them, it was 90 articles in total and 37 invitations. I got 20 authors from studies participating, and it was like 20 and 5, and the other 5 were recommendations from those authors. So I assume that they had some knowledge on ethanol from the beginning. In the questionnaire, well, in the first the guidance document, they had some basic information too about what we were trying to do and what would be the basic scenarios with which we would work. And then in the questionnaire, you also would have some guidance for them. But I didn't prepare a workshop with so I had to adapt everything with a very different Delphi.
It's my turn now. I was wondering also, is reversibility catched everybody's attention because it's really surprising also. But I was more interested in the monitorability. And actually, it's the one that we talked less, so if you could just, how can, if you go back to your definition of those concepts there, I was just wondering, what kind of responses did you get to the indicators needed? Because I don't really see the difference between the monitorability of the two systems that you mentioned. I mean, what is the difference in this sense?
Monitorability is not the system monitorability, but the impacts monitorability. So you're going to monitor, what you monitor is not the system, it's the impact. So you're monitoring water security. You might think that monitoring water security at the conversion process level would be easier or more difficult than at the feedstock production level. Or you might think that monitoring food security is much harder than monitoring exclusion of small-scale farmers, because you could, for example, you could use some invoice systems to map or to track those small-scale farmers that are included in the supply chain. And you could use also indicators. Well, there were people from environmental studies that say you could use indicators on your soil just to know if your soil is, for example, losing changes on property, so that will have an influence in water. So they could. So the monitorability is how easy or hard to monitor in your perception, which is really subjective. But would you say that it's easier to monitor, for example, inclusion of low-skilled workers at the conversion process level than it is to monitor food security at the international level? Which is basically, they would say that yes, but in the first round, it was really hard to assess that criterion. I tried myself the survey, and 2 more people tried the survey. It was really hard to do the survey. And the second round, so the first round, you would get a 3 for monitorability for almost all impacts. You really didn't have a really substantive or important kind of reliable kind of indication of their perception of monitorability. But then, like they would say that they would indicate monitorability can depend on the capacity of the who's doing the monitoring to actually do it, human, money, resources. So you would have low, middle, and high income countries, and they would just say if the perceived monitorability would be higher for high income countries or lower for low income countries, which was the pattern. Lower monitorability for impacts that are happening in low income countries and higher for high income countries.
And you also mentioned this intrinsic and extrinsic variables.
Yeah.
How do they?
That was all my presentation. That was when we were talking. Okay.
It was here also.
Did I say anything about intrinsic and extrinsic? Okay. That's something that. Oh, okay, it's true. Yeah, this is something that I'm trying I'm thinking about it, because what I saw was that you would think you would be comfortable with assessing an impact from a technical perspective, just looking at a matter of efficiency, for example, in the system. You would say, this system is very efficient, so you won't have problems at this level. When in reality, someone else would say that it does not depend on the characteristic of the system, of the technical system, but how the regulatory mechanisms are put in place and how you control it. And also for monitorability, that would be a big thing, you know. Yeah, so, but not just that, for example, food security. Some would say, some from Brazil, that was, so it was 7 different countries, and we had people from Brazil, and from Brazil they would say, oh, food security will depend very much on social policies. If you do have social policies in place, you can mitigate those impacts, you know, with social policies. So it wouldn't depend on, for example, the displacement of food crops only, but also because food security, it's also it's always the 2 dimensions. They're always complementing each other, because of course almost all systems are social technical systems, right? They cannot exist in their own because they get to the point where they get implemented. So it's so totally different from looking from a technical perspective, which funnily, really in a funny way, is what is driving policy making now on advanced biofuels. They're looking at technical features which are now proved with real data at the experimental level, and at the real level, where you have policy relevant problems, you don't really have simulation data. You don't even use that. You don't really have real data to basically think about those potential impacts.
I guess we're done. I think we had a very good panel, very good presentations. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the presenters. Let's get some